Hello, welcome to the Ganamorphy. Thank you for joining us again as we take another hodgepodge delve through history. My name is Will. I'm a history enthusiast / amateur. And with me, as always, is my co-host Nick. In the world of historians, Nick is sort of your university professor and I'm more your homeopathic advisor.
I mean that's grossly inaccurate, but I'll take that, yeah.
But yeah, thank you for joining us. So, what are we going to talk about today then, Nick?
Today we're going to be talking about something which touches our lives every day. So hopefully you all guessed what we're going to be talking about. That was the sounds of coffee.
Something I'm sure is very near and dear to our hearts.
Yes, that sort of fabled black liquid that has that rich aroma, nice fragrance, and just that indefinable taste that when you first have it makes you want to throw up.
It's funny that, isn't it? Most people, when you drink it first, you hate it, and then gradually you get to like it, and then you just sort of can't live without it. It's a bit like whiskey.
Okay, that explains all the bottles. I think in terms of beverages you're going to drink, it's probably better if you have a coffee addiction than a whiskey addiction.
I think so, probably. So, let's start with coffee.
So coffee is drunk all around the world, and it's massively important to a lot of people to get their day going, but it's also a sort of important cultural thing as well. In fact, in the US alone, 56% of US adults start their day with drinking a cup of coffee.
Coffee has really become something of a ritual in certain parts of the world. I know here in the UK we have things like coffee mornings.
Well, that's just an excuse to have lots of cake, but yes, I'll take your point. But coffee has a rather interesting history. It's one of those things that everyone sort of enjoys, everyone loves, but no one really sort of knows where it came from, like maybe even how it's made. But the truth is, coffee came from somewhere you probably wouldn't maybe expect, and that's Ethiopia.
For some reason, I always thought that the coffee plant came from South America, but it didn't. It was brought there, and
It was brought there by the French, but also partially thanks to Napoleon as well.
Pops up everywhere, doesn't he?
Yeah, for a man who was so short. Although actually, that's a myth as well. He wasn't that short. He was quite tall for his era.
So coffee, we can trace it back to Ethiopia. There's a bit of debate. Some people say Yemen, but Ethiopia seems to have the stronger claim from what I was able to see.
Basically, all the scholars out there pretty much say it's Ethiopia, mainly because Ethiopia also invaded Yemen and more than likely brought the coffee plant over. So they've got a creation myth. So the legend goes that in Ethiopia there was a goat herder named Kaldi, and he discovered coffee after he noticed that his goats were eating the berries from a certain tree, and they became really energetic and running around, and they didn't want to sleep. So, very much the effect coffee has on humans, as well as goats. It's nice to know there's cross-species similarities there. And basically, he reported his findings to an abbot of a local monastery who made the drink with the berries and found that it kept him alert through hours of evening prayer. And from there, the abbot shared this discovery, and coffee became a staple of Ethiopian culture and life.
And of course, Ethiopia is still a major producer of coffee beans today. Obviously eclipsed slightly by other parts of the world.
Coffee in Ethiopia is very important to the culture. So when it was originally sort of made, it was originally actually called bun. And they used it in lots of different ways. So initially they would chew the beans and the leaves of the plant. Then they started boiling it with water, mixing it with animal fat and eating it as a snack. And they even made a sort of sweet beverage called kashir out of the husks. So it's a pretty versatile, it's actually a fruit. It's a pretty versatile fruit. And it's not an actual bean, but it first appears anywhere in the world, at least in print form, by a Persian physician known as Raziz. And it kind of crops up continually throughout the following centuries in sort of Arabian texts. And the first accounts of it sort of being drunk in the way we drink it today were actually in Yemen by a bunch of monks in the Sofi monasteries. And that was around the sort of 15th century.
Yes, so while the origins of the coffee plant can be traced back to Ethiopia, as you say, Yemen is really kind of the birthplace of what we know as coffee today. We can actually trace our word coffee back to the Arabic word for wine, which I believe is kahwa. And then we can trace that word through Turkish, where it becomes kahve, and then into English, where we get coffee.
That's exactly right. And the Arab world is pretty much at the heart of why coffee is so popular around the world today, and it's where it sort of gradually expanded from. When Turkey invaded Yemen in the 16th century, they set up a coffee trade and basically jealously guarded the product. They would not let any berries outside the country that you could then germinate and grow something from. So you could argue that Turkey sort of started the modern coffee trade. But of course, eventually, if something's popular and tasty and people enjoy it, people will find a way to circumvent this. And there was one Muslim pilgrim who managed to smuggle some seeds out taped on his belly, and he took them all the way to southern India, where they started growing the plant. Then the Dutch managed to sneak one out from the port town of Aden, took it all the way to Ceylon. In fact, the Dutch were very instrumental in helping spread coffee around sort of Western Europe and also a bit further afield as well, but just because they had, they were one of the great expanders of the sort of 15th to 17th centuries, along with the Spanish and the Portuguese and, of course, the English eventually.
Yeah, so it's around this time becoming more widespread in Europe as well, don't we?
Yeah, so when coffee first sort of picked up steam in the Arab world, you had coffee houses being set up. And it's kind of funny, for the next couple of hundred years, no matter where coffee appears, the same sort of pattern repeats itself. These places get set up, people go in to drink it, they talk to different people of different social backgrounds, they exchange different ideas, and it starts to worry all the local rulers. So in Mecca, there was actually a ban. But this got overturned by a couple of local rulers who thought, no, I don't want this. I like coffee too much.
We can also see Christianity sort of weighing in on this. Again, in the 16th century, there were calls for the Pope to ban coffee because of the effect that coffee houses were having on society. Unfortunately, though, Pope Clement VIII quite enjoyed coffee, though. So he decided that it shouldn't be banned, and even suggested that it could be baptised. Quite an early European fan there in Pope Clement VIII.
Exactly that. In fact, I think he said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, this is too good for the infidel to drink. Let's make this a Christian drink. He liked it that much. He decided not to listen to any of his advisors who were saying, this is an evil drink.
Probably would have said it in Latin as well.
But yeah, so it took off relatively quickly around the different European countries. Obviously, Italy was the first, Germany and England. In fact, France was probably one of the slower adopters because they were worried about it replacing wine. I know it's surprising. The French like wine. So you had all these French doctors coming out going, oh, coffee's bad for you. You shouldn't drink it. Drink wine. Obviously, they changed their tune pretty quickly. And now we associate coffee. I'd say France is one of the big coffee drinkers of the world in my head.
Well, they have a press named after them.
Yes, the French press. Or if you go to France, the press. But funny enough, a lot of people, before coffee came along as this beverage you could drink in the morning, a lot of people would drink beer or wine for breakfast.
It's not a bad idea. Was that a cultural thing, or?
People drank beer because it was seen as a stimulant and it would pick you up for the day and it would make you work a bit harder. And coffee came along and was preferred because it didn't make you as drunk.
It's interesting that, because I have never felt that I work harder after drinking beer.
No, it's because it was a sort of barley concoction, most of the beers in Europe, and there was this perception that they gave you lots of energy.
Oh. Is this where the thinking comes from that pregnant women should drink Guinness?
I didn't know that was a piece of advice. If you are pregnant and you are listening, please consult your doctor before prescribing yourself Guinness, or indeed any other alcoholic beverage.
Yes, do not take any medical advice from this podcast. So coffee, it arrives in Europe. It's quite big, surprisingly, in England. We think of England as being a nation of tea drinkers. But this introduction of coffee actually predates England's fascination with tea. And we see these things called penny universities spring up, because for the price of a penny, an Englishman can go into a coffee house, buy a coffee, and engage in conversation with the clientele, who normally sort of a place to go and gossip, wasn't it?
One of the scary things about coffee houses for rulers, you went into a coffee house, they didn't serve alcohol, you just had coffee and you were sober, so you could talk and you could exchange ideas quite freely rather than just getting trashed. So, it's good to know that the culture of English binge drinking has a long and healthy tradition. They wouldn't exchange ideas, they wouldn't talk about politics, but in a coffee house, they would. And there's this argument that the sort of coffee houses are the birthplaces of democracy in a way. There's this spine of sort of social engagement and political engagement that perhaps hadn't been really thought about before. And it got to the point it really worried Charles II. So he issued a proclamation in 1675 to suppress coffee houses. He lost the ensuing battle. By 1700, there were more than 2,000 London coffee houses alone. And they took up more space and more rent than any other business in London. What was interesting about coffee houses was that they weren't all the same. So although you had different people mixing, different coffee houses would sort of cater to sort of different clientele. So there'd be like a coffee house of lawyers, or there'd be one frequented by sailors.
Yes, and on the topic of sailors, one of the more popular coffee houses for sailors and merchants was Edward Lloyd's coffee shop in London. Edward Lloyd used to prepare ship lists for underwriters who would visit his coffee shop so that they could sell insurance to the sailors and the merchants. So he used to prepare these ship lists for the underwriters, and from this he eventually founded his own insurance company, which we know today as Lloyd's of London, not to be confused with Lloyd's Bank. It's funny that we think of ourselves as a nation of tea drinkers, and yet it was all about coffee back then.
Tea sort of crept in around the sort of 18th century when Britain's forays into India were making headway. You know, tea was becoming a major export, mainly thanks to the East India Company, who basically pushed tea really hard. It's a lot easier to prepare as well. But you also had this kind of weird social division suddenly happening. So whereas before you had people meeting in coffee houses of different walks of life, these kind of got replaced with specific clubs for gentlemen. So you had the emergence of public tea rooms, which were kind of similar to coffee houses, but not as socially stretched as their predecessors. And so gradually sort of tea took hold in the British psyche as being our drink. We've never really looked back. I mean, we still love coffee here, but tea is kind of, you know, when you think of England, you think of tea. Tea and the Queen.
You don't associate tea so much with a sort of social discourse either as you do with the coffee shops. Tea is, I feel, is a much more polite drink. You have it with cucumber sandwiches in the afternoon.
It's also the reason why America is such a massive coffee drinker. So obviously, you know what the Boston Tea Party is. It's when, you know, the Americans decided to dump all the tea into the sea because they didn't want to pay the tax on it. So Americans used to love tea, but after that, and obviously the ensuing revolution, tea became unpatriotic for Americans to drink.
Yes, speaking of coffee in the Americas, we can actually thank our friends the Dutch again for bringing it to the Americas.
Oh, I love the Dutch.
They've done so much for coffee.
Well, it's true, isn't it, that obviously we when we say coffee, there's a synonym for it was Java, which the Dutch used to rule.
Oh, really?
And it's where they brought coffee, one of the places they originally brought coffee when they managed to smuggle the tree to Ceylon.
Oh,
so that's why we think of Java when we think of coffee, because it was one of the centres of coffee production.
I just feel this whole podcast has given me a new respect for the Dutch.
You mean you didn't have one already?
Oh, no, it doesn't love some Gouda.
Isn't it Gouda?
Is it Gouda? I don't know.
Someone Dutch write in to complain. Tell us how we say it right.
But yes, going back to the Dutch, 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam gave the King of France, Louis XIV, the gift of a young coffee plant. He ordered this plant to be planted in a garden in Paris.
What else would you do with a plant?
I don't know.
Wear it as a hat.
You know, I don't know enough about Louis XIV, to be honest.
He was a crazy fella. He was a Sun King.
Oh, he might have worn it as a hat then, mightn't he? On this occasion, though, he did the sensible thing. He planted it in a garden in Paris, and the plant grew. And then in 1723, a young naval officer took a cutting from the plant, and he took that over to the Americas with him. And he ended up in Martinique, and he planted it, and it grew. And it is from this cutting that all the coffee plants in the Americas are derived. This is sort of the ancestor of basically the American coffee industry.
It's also the birth of a very, very dark period of history. Once coffee arrived to that region of the world, you had massive sugar plantations already in full swing, producing white gold. That industry was sort of waning. The profit wasn't as good as it was. And coffee came along and it began to fill the void because demand for coffee was just growing around the world. And so lots of poor Africans who had been brought from Africa to farm sugarcane were now being put to work to farm coffee. And in fact, Haiti became the capital of coffee. It took over from, you know, places like Yemen and Java and different places that had assumed the mantle. By 1788, San Domingo supplied half the world's coffee. And it was all through the power of slavery. And the only reason it stopped was because one of the few slave revolts in history that was actually successful was in San Domingo.
There seem to be two things that you can't escape when you're looking at history. That's slavery and Napoleon.
On the topic of French people, or rather Corsican people who wanted to be French, it was Napoleon who's arguably responsible for giving Brazil coffee. Like, if you're drinking instant coffee, it's probably going to be a Brazilian bean. He captured Lisbon in 1807, and in the process drove out the Portuguese royal family who fled to Brazil. And they took their passion for coffee with them, and they set up the first makings of the Brazilian coffee industry. But there was obviously a huge slavery cost to it all. In fact, even when Western countries were starting to look at slavery and go, actually, we probably shouldn't be doing this, Brazil just gave them lip service and kept employing slaves. And then after, when British ships would come along and then stop slave boats, the Brazilians just sort of worked it out so that their slaves became indentured servants. It was really staggering, the abuses they laid upon people just to grow coffee and earn cash. But what's more interesting is that it was only in 1871 when this new law was announced called the Law of the Free Womb, which effectively meant that any slave who had children after that year, those children would be free. So there was, they didn't free the slaves. They just said, any children you have, they'll be free, but you're still a slave.
What a weird term for it.
Yeah. But in addition to that, there's a huge environmental cost as well. So lots of, obviously, rainforest and other bits of land were dug up, and all these coffee crops were laid out because they had such a rich soil in Brazil that they could do that. But obviously it had huge environmental impacts, which last until today. They're still doing it.
I think part of the reason why coffee has been so successful, especially in South America, is as a plant, I think it tends to prefer higher altitude, doesn't it? That's the thing with coffee. That's why there's not many great British coffee growers.
I think it's generally accepted it's somewhere between about 3,000 to 4,000 feet is good for growing coffee. You get the best kind of flavour for it, and obviously South America has a unique landscape.
Yeah. Do you know about the two types of coffee? We have Robusta and we have Arabica, and it tends to be that Arabica likes higher altitude, and whereas Robusta you can grow slightly lower down. Generally, people seem to think that Arabica produces a nicer coffee. It's a bit more nuanced, it's a bit sweeter. Whereas Robusta tends to be a bit more
robust.
People,
hence the name.
People say it has a sort of savoury tone. Some people say it tastes a bit like an ashtray or rubber. But a lot of British people, especially our parents' generation, would be most familiar with instant coffee. Instant coffee tends to be made with cheaper beans, which tend to be Robusta, which is why instant coffee has that very identifiable funky taste to it, the kind of burnt rubber.
I haven't had instant coffee for probably about 12 years.
Okay,
so I can't remember.
Think about why you don't drink it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a fair point.
We do look down on instant coffee, and sometimes with good reason, but really instant coffee was one of the things which really pushed coffee into the homes. You should think that you have the coffee beans, and even if you get somebody else to roast them, to grind them for you, you've still got to have some kind of apparatus where you can make the coffee. Most people don't, at least historically, do not have these sort of things in their kitchens. You go to the coffee shop and you have it. But with the introduction of instant coffee, you've got coffee in the home. You can have it whenever you want. No,
it's exactly that. And interestingly enough, instant coffee was invented, funny enough, by the French.
Again.
Yeah. It was in about 1881. Instant coffee was versatile and it lasted longer. It was also really good to send to, obviously, soldiers during war. And, the Great World Wars helped advance the science behind it as well, making it stay fresher for longer, giving it a bit of a better flavour. But essentially it is still rubbish stuff.
It is. But, I mean, I would say, some people, this might be a British thing, but I know people, and they should be older people, who are so used to instant coffee that is what coffee tastes like. My sister's boyfriend's a pain because when he comes round, we have nice coffee and he won't drink it. We have to go out and get, a jar of instant for him. And it just sits there all year round, just waiting for him to come round to visit again because nobody else will drink it. But
well, the beauty of it is it will last all year round.
That's the point. I mean, we have a pot in the cupboard now. It's about 18 months old. It tastes exactly the same as it did when it was new. But so instant coffee, I think actually instant coffee, it should be given a bit more respect.
And I don't, because it was originally peddled by Nestle and Maxwell House, who are evil corporations, in my opinion.
That was my next point. This is also the beginning of coffee being marketed to consumers as, a luxury product. You think Maxwell House and Nescafe, and they're all branded products in the shops that people go out and buy, and there were big marketing campaigns about it. We actually see the beginnings of the first reference to a coffee break around this time, 1902. The Pan American Coffee Bureau, who was sort of industry body for coffee producers, they released an advert which said, "Give yourself a coffee break and get what coffee gives to you." And this is the first reference to a coffee break. There's a really good article from about 15 years ago by a lady called Trish Skay, and in this article she outlined what she called the 3 waves of coffee. The first wave of coffee, we have the rise of instant and coffee as a product, and we see these brands like Maxwell House and stuff appearing. So when we get to sort of the 1970s, we have kind of a second wave of coffee, and this is, as these things tend to go, a reaction to the first wave. So we have people who have been brought up with instant coffee, and suddenly ground coffee becomes more widely available. People have brewing equipment in their homes around this time. We have the cafetiere, we have the mocha pot. People are starting to brew coffee at home. It's still quite a niche thing. But also we see the formation of Starbucks, and in UK Costa Coffee in the 1970s. But this is where it started, this pushback against instant. It's very commercially driven. And then 30 years later we have another pushback against this, and we have the third wave, which is where people start prioritizing the quality of coffee over how it is marketed to you. And that's kind of where we are now.
It's amazing how little our taste for coffee has changed over the last, century since it was originally founded, and how we consume it hasn't really changed. And it's very much a part of our lives, always has been. You could almost say it's a driver of history in a way. But we've got to be more mindful of the effects of the demand coffee has. People are still working for pittance, growing and harvesting these plants, but the way they grow them is not sustainable.
We as sort of consumers just need to be mindful of where our coffee is coming from. Now seems like a good time for us to discuss our interesting facts.
What has got your mind percolating?
I like it.
Yeah.
Yes. So here's something I found quite interesting. There are large parts of the world where it's common for people to be lactose intolerant to some extent. We believe this is why in sort of the Arabic world there's a preference for drinking coffee black, possibly because of this inherent lactose intolerance. And we can also see this sort of predisposition in southern Europe, which includes Italy. Now, Italy is known for having a very strong coffee culture, as well as being the birthplace of several very famous milky coffee drinks. We have things like the cappuccino and the cafe latte. But in Italy, there's a sort of rule that you don't drink a milky coffee in the afternoon, which sounds a bit odd to us, not being Italians. I know in Britain, it's very acceptable to drink, you can have a cappuccino any time of the day and nobody will say anything about it. This rule in Italy stems from this sort of genetic predisposition for lactose intolerance, in that you could have one coffee in the morning and you'll be fine. But if you're drinking them all day, you're going to end up feeling quite unwell.
Just to jump in on your facts, sorry, Will. The first recorded account of milk being added to coffee was actually by the Dutch when they were trying to introduce it to China.
The Dutch again.
Yes, the Dutch and the French seem to have their fingers everywhere. Funny enough, that's also because obviously China, they drink a lot of tea and they add milk in China to their tea. Despite the perception that they're all herbal teas in China, they used to enjoy milk with their tea.
Yeah, interestingly, apparently in China, the recent craze has been for cheese. I guess because cheese is maybe more exotic, a foreign item for them. And that has kind of crept into coffee. You now have cheese-flavoured coffees. I don't think I want to try one.
No, I think I'm good there as well. If you ever visit there, don't bring that back. But But no, milk has long been used as a kind of sweetener for coffee. It's why we put it in coffee, because it makes coffee taste a little nicer. It's a bit like, so if you have sugar and milk, you're basically double sweetening your coffee, really.
Yeah, and when you steam milk, you're actually you're bringing out some of the sugars in milk as well, so you're making it even sweeter. Hot and frothy, that's just how we like it.
So my fact also involves something hot and frothy. So remember we talked about how these coffee houses are sort of almost great social levelers. Well, that didn't apply, as most things in history, that didn't apply to women. And so in 1674, there was a group founded called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, who basically complained that coffee was making their men impotent. They wrote a pamphlet which basically said, "We find of late a very sensible decay of that true old English vigour. Never did men wear greater breeches or carry less in them of any metal whatsoever."
This is the cosmopolitan of its age, isn't it?
Yeah, basically, yeah. In response, the men defended their beverage. They said that coffee makes the erection more vigorous, the ejaculation more full, and adds a spiritual essency to the sperm. But interestingly, modern-day studies have shown that caffeine may actually help sperm mobility to the point that it's actually useful in artificial insemination. So I think the men have that one from the 17th century, I'm sad to say.
I think now's a good time for us to discuss some myths that we'd like to dispel.
There's lots of different studies about the effects of caffeine on people. And, you know, some people have said that caffeine can calm down people with ADHD. Some people say it's perfectly healthy for you. It helps you focus, makes you faster. In fact, there was at one point the International Olympic Committee considered caffeine a sort of doping agent because they thought it helped people too much. But there's lots of different research still to be done on caffeine, and opinions about it change every day. You know, you can see news articles saying it prevents cancer or it causes cancer. So take what you read with a pinch of salt. One of the things that does get said about coffee, if you drink too much of it, you get a bit dehydrated, and it's just not true because it's 95% water you're drinking usually. So when you drink coffee, you can stay just as hydrated as if you're drinking water. Of course, drinking water is always the best thing to do.
I think it's the old adage of everything in moderation.
Everything in moderation, yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
But on that slightly less exciting note than the women's pamphlet of the 1600s, what is your myth?
I think from what you're saying, we can really say that caffeine makes you harder, stronger, better, faster.
Yeah, it makes you go one more time.
Yes. So my myth. There's a belief that the darker you roast a coffee bean, the more caffeine it will have. We see this sometimes when we see energy drinks, which are kind of, you know, where coffee is an ingredient. They'll specify it's a dark roast coffee because we associate that with, you know, strong flavours. And from there, you know, lots of caffeine, lots of energy. The effects of coffee are kind of concentrated. But that's not really the case.
So I'm just getting flashbacks to my childhood where my mum would burn everything because she said it was tastier and safer to eat. So is this the same sort of concept? People just overcooking beans because they think it makes it stronger?
Quite possibly, if your mother was a coffee roaster.
Well, it's roaster. Incinerator.
Yeah. A coffee bean will have essentially the same amount of caffeine no matter how you decide to roast it. It just has that amount of caffeine. The reason why there is this belief is partially because a darker roasted coffee is stronger. When you roast a coffee darker, it loses more moisture and it becomes lighter as a bean. So if you are measuring out your coffee by weight, you will end up with more dark roast beans than you would by the same weight of light roast beans. And of course, more beans means more caffeine. So, as always, we really are just scratching the surface here, aren't we? There's only so much information you can pack into a half-hour podcast, but we hope what we've
ground it down for you and distilled it into something with a rich aroma and delicious aftertaste.
I couldn't have said it better myself. If you have any comments, questions, complaints, anything at all, please feel free to get in touch. You can contact us at info@thegallimorphery.show.
And on that, just before we go, what are we going to be talking about in the next show, Will?
Next show is going to be an interesting one. We're going to be looking at the story behind HMS. What?
The next show is going to be an interesting one.
Yes.
Whereas this one was absolute dross.
No comment. The next show is going to be we're going to be looking at the story behind HMS Bounty and the mutineers and how they ended up on Pitcairn Island. But yes, please join us next time. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon. But until then, all I have to say is see you latte.